There we go. Welcome to you all to the Blavatnik School of Government. It's such a delight to see you all here. I'm Ngaire Woods, Dean of the Blavatnik School, and welcome to everybody who's online joining us for this evening's book talk. It's such a thrill to have you back. Cathy Ashton, born to a mining family in Up Holland, Lancashire, and then now Baroness Ashton. And her book covers, as you all know, that period when she was the European Union's first ever foreign policy czar. The book is called
And Then What?
And Then What? Wonderful title, and is available, and I'm going to say this at the end if I remember as well. It's just outside, it's only £20, and it's a fabulous read, so you're going to want to get the book before you leave tonight. But tell us why the title?
So when I was dealing with lots of different issues, I would often say to the officials who would bring me recommendations that the question we had to answer was, and then what? What do we do next? Because particularly when you're dealing with a crisis, you are by definition dealing with a situation where you don't have all the information, or it would be a crisis. And where you're trying to work out what the best thing to do in those circumstances. And the problem in foreign policy is that we often think short term. We kind of deal with the crisis, damp down the flames and move on. Because there's often another issue, problem, crisis, war, heading behind it. And so it was a way of trying to say, we have to think longer term by starting with, okay, we do this, and then what? And it was, I suppose, a way too of trying to get people to think through the consequences of what looked like a good idea, an action that you hoped would have a good effect. Yeah, but and then what? Or what happens if things go differently?
I remember President Obama's former chief of staff sitting here saying that the special Obama factor to every discussion was to begin with the question, what is the right thing to do? How often does that happen when you're the European Union's foreign policy head?
So the point about the European Union is that it was born from the ashes of conflict, that in Europe we know a lot about how to do things badly, how to fight each other, how to create mayhem, and we've learnt largely not to do it. And so the offer that it makes to people is, we have learned to sit around a table and resolve our problems in that way. It is the only place in the world where, as an ambassador, to fail to reach agreement is to fail in your job. Most ambassadors stand behind their country's position and often don't move. That's their job. But in Brussels, your job is to find agreement. And if you're the one standing out, you have failed. So you have a combination of this desire to show that we know how to do things, hopefully peacefully, together with the values that make the European Union what it is. It's about democracy, it's about freedom, it's about human rights, it's about all the elements that we think of that allow us, them, to be able to live the lives that they do. It's not perfect.
But when you talk about reaching agreement, you're talking about reaching internal agreement on what the European Union's position is. But then what about the European Union's relationship with other parts of the world, which your book deals so brilliantly with? What's your job there? Is it always to come back with an agreement?
Depends what the issue is. I mean, you know, you're dealing with, on the one hand, trying to develop a stronger relationship with a country like South Korea, where you might work together on issues as disparate as piracy off the Somali coast or security issues in their region. Or you might be in the Middle East talking about the situation in Yemen, or the situation between Israel and Palestine, or the situation with Libya, Egypt, Iran, and so on. It could be any number of different ways in which you're trying to take the power, soft as it is at times, of the 27, it was 28, it's now 27, EU member countries, and to project what we know and what we're capable of into the situation that you find yourself in. And sometimes it's about strengthening with your allies, other times it's about trying to resolve a problem.
Let's dive into a couple of those cases, and I'd love you all to come in with your questions. And I thought we'd cover a menu of some of the things that Cathy did in this role, and a couple of the things she's been doing since. But please do jump in with your questions as we go along. But if we take what you just said, we dive in. February 2014, Crimea. Yanukovych, you're sent to Crimea to talk to Yanukovych because Ukraine was to Kyiv to talk to Yanukovych because Ukraine has just rejected joining the European Union through an association agreement. Not joining, but having an association agreement with the European Union. So you fly off to Kyiv, pick up the story, tell us, what kind of guy was Yanukovych?
Well, I call him Yanukovych.
Yanukovych, right.
No, but that's interesting because there's just different pronunciations and it depends on which part of the world you sit. I went in earlier than that to begin with because he had made the decision after 7 years of negotiation on the agreement. It was initialed, which means it was done. All we needed was a ceremony when he would actually sign it. And that was going to be in November 2013. And he announced a week before that he wasn't going to sign it. And came to the event where this was to take place, which is when he told me. He came across the room and he said, I can't sign this. And I went to Kyiv a couple of weeks later to do two things. One is to sit down with him for what turned out to be hours, to try and understand why and why now after all this negotiation, and to go to Maidan and to meet all of the people who were carrying EU flags, who were very angry that a president who had stood on a platform for election of getting Ukraine into a strong trade, economic, but also broader relationship with Europe had simply reneged on that. What was very clear to me, and the story of all of that is in the book, was that he was never going to sign it. And that the reason fundamentally was because he felt that the relationship with Russia was much more important to him. And there had been moves by Russia to cut off trade, to make life more complicated for Ukraine. They had threatened to call in the debts, and they had threatened to cut off gas supplies, both to the country itself and obviously as a transit route. And he caved into the pressure of that. And then, as you know, left to go and live in Rostov-on-Don, which is in Russia.
Mm-hmm. And then in Crimea?
Well, then we had a situation which built up over those months, and I went back many times. And if you are in a situation, and some of you may have been exactly in these places where things are dramatically changing, you can taste it. It's like the air is different, right? It's just extraordinary. You can feel it build, and you can feel that something is going to happen, and you don't quite know what. You had the invasion of Russia of Crimea, and then you had the move into Donbass. And at the same time, you had Yanukovych gone, and you had the move towards a new president, and the Rada, the parliament, trying to work out through its own constitution what to do. And there were moments when I would sit with the leadership in the Rada, where people would be passing laws, just excitement of being able to do what they wanted, that feeling of control. And you would look out into the darkness outside and see little fires blazing, or people carrying guns, or that real sense of dramatic change and a sense of liberation often. and it never lasts. It's not going to feel like that a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later. Doesn't mean it has to be bad, but it's not going to stay like that. And it's a really strange, heady, heavy feeling that you have in the air. And what you then saw was, for years really, that Russia had created the circumstances where Ukraine was not whole. It was like a wedge in the country. Same in Georgia, same in Moldova. In other words, that the country cannot do what it wants to do because it's not complete. And because it's not complete, it can't join things, because even if it wants to, the organization it wants to join is going to say, whoa, no, not till you're complete. We don't want to import the problem. And anyway, how would you be able to show that you represented the entire country, which is important in a democratic process? And your resources are constantly having to deal with the problem that will spark off at any time. As I was saying to you before, the last place I was before lockdown was back in Kyiv, talking about what did we do to try and alleviate the problems that were still going on in the Donbass. Situations that were very practical and very important. People who couldn't live there, people whose houses had been destroyed, people who couldn't collect their pensions, the problem that the water table, particularly under the mining area, had been contaminated, and that meant you had a risk to health of people actually drinking water that was bad for them. All of these things that go on that are the sort of day-to-day grind of people who are not able to live freely in their country. And then we saw the invasion last year.
Were you surprised?
Yes. I was expecting something. It was obvious that he had decided from the Kremlin to move. He was very unhappy with the regime as he sees it in Kyiv, didn't like Zelensky. But I had thought, along with practically everyone else, I think, that he would simply either want to consolidate what he'd taken in Donbass, or to do the land bridge over to Crimea, or both. I did not expect him to try and move against the whole country.
And what would you be doing now if you were the European Union foreign policy czar?
I think what I would have done if I had been in office, and this is not a criticism of what the people who are in office do, because you do what you do with the information you have. So I've been out of office a while. But I think what I would have done is flown to Beijing on day one. Because what I would have really wanted to understand is how far China and Russia were going to join up together. And the reason I would have done that was because I spent 4.5 years negotiating with the Iranians, with China and Russia as part of the team. So I had seen that relationship up close, and I had also worked very closely with both throughout that period. And remember, that period included the initial moves by Russia into Ukraine. I would be spending a week in Vienna with Russian officials and ministers discussing the Iran deal, and then I would fly to Kyiv, where they were definitely not my ally. They were my enemy, if you like. And they would fly back to Moscow, and they would be attacking the EU, and I would be attacking them, and then we would fly back to Vienna. And the reason it matters is I think, a couple of things. One is that you learn about how people are. So I would have gone to talk to the Chinese, would be my instinct. But also that you learn about the art of compartmentalization, putting things in a box, which is very complicated, because people say, how can you talk to them about anything? But we're not going to sort climate change if we don't talk to everybody. There are some things which you have to continue the dialogue with, however complicated and difficult it is. And I'm not saying the right way is always to sort of put things in boxes, but you've just got to be aware that even while something terrible is going on, you're never dealing with one problem. They don't come in a nice line. You know, they're like buses, they all come together.
A question.
Well, I would like to know one of you.
Do introduce yourself
Yeah,
first.
I am Andres Gutierrez. I am a visitor, academic visitor at the Latin American Center. I'm from Colombia. And I would like to know your point of view about finding a solution in the war against Russia and Ukraine. If you think there is a political and diplomatic solution at the same time, and also your views about the role of the UN Security Council and the Secretary General.
The people who will decide when it is time to negotiate, should they choose to do so, will be the people of Ukraine and President Zelensky. And he will do that when he believes that he has either made the progress he wants to, won the war, or decided for whatever reasons that he wants to start a discussion. It is not for us to tell him when. It is for us to stand ready to support and help in any way that we can. And what I would say is that in my experience, it's quite important to have worked out the process you're going to use. You can spend a lot of time in negotiations arguing about where you're going to go and the shape of the table when you get there. I spent a very long discussion actually about Ukraine on the subject of whether the flags in the room truly represented the people who were sitting there. And this was all to do with whether the Ukrainian team meeting the Russian team were Ukraine or Ukrainian. In other words, did they represent the country or part of the country? And depending on which view you took, the flag was appropriate or not. So believe me, you could spend weeks on where are we going to go to meet. And so my advice would always be, even when you're in the midst of the war, you need people somewhere thinking about when we get to that point, where are we going to be? Who's going to host? Who needs to be in the room? What are the issues? Because even if you win everything, if you take the situation for Ukraine, there are people who've disappeared into Russia. They've got to get home. There's a whole question of rebuilding the country. There's lots and lots of things that you have to be able to discuss. So you need to think about the process that you want to use and start getting that ready, because things can change dramatically and you need to be ready to go if you're in a position where you feel it is time to do some negotiation of some kind, even if it's only to release prisoners. In the context of the Security Council, well, it would be very difficult to invent the UN right now. Thank goodness we've already got it. And the UN for me is a tanker at sea, like the EU, like NATO, these bodies that have got depth and breadth and strength. They move slowly, they're hard to maneuver, they're difficult because they have lots of rules about consensus and vetoes and stuff. But they keep going, and they keep going despite everything you throw at them. And they're much, much more valuable than we think they are. The Security Council and the veto of the 5 permanent members has always been an issue. And as you know, Russia has used its veto much more in the last few years, post the Libya abstention, than it did before. But we should carry on trying to use the Security Council as far as we possibly can. One of the tragedies for me of the decision by President Trump to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal was that this was a deal which I chaired for 4.5 years, that was done by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany. And it is the only deal in history where all 5 permanent members work together. And when I say work together, they worked together to the point where, even though they had extraordinarily different views about what a deal needed to look like, they stuck together until all were satisfied. So we're in a terribly difficult place now, but I would keep the tanker. I'd keep it moving. I'd rub a bit of rust off it every now and then, give it a clean. And I'd just make sure that we find ways over time, because countries change, leaders change, wars end, situations change, to make sure we are ready to use the Security Council where we can.
And look, it's a trademark of Cathy Ashton's job that she's always described as just quietly getting on with the job. She walked into my office this afternoon and I said, wow, you know, the book's been fantastically reviewed by all the reviewers that most authors, you know, would love to have. She goes, oh, you know, yeah, it's doing all right. And I sat and thought, you know, I've done a number of different book launches this last year. And every other author gives me a list of all the prizes they've won and all the places they've been reviewed. And it is a mark. And I just want to, before coming to another question from the audience, I just want to pick that up because it's a theme in the book that amidst all the kind of, I think one reviewer talks it, you know, amidst all the ego and testosterone of international diplomacy, there you are quietly staying the course and trying to think literally about and then what. And, you know, the Haiti is another case in the book where, you know, we were speaking in the school last week about just the very short term, the need every time to put a sticking plaster on Haiti, and donors every year for the last 50 years saying, we don't have time to do something more long term. We've got to just patch, and with some severe consequences. But when you look at the sweep of your book, the Arab Spring and Egypt, Afghanistan, Crimea, Ukraine, Iran, Haiti, it feels as though that message, your message, which is we've got to have a strategy that's not just put the sticking plaster on, but is long term. It's a very hard one. Where do you feel that you most were able to persuade people to take a slightly more long term, slightly less ego and testosterone view of what needed to be done?
So I think it's very nice for you to say all that nice things about me. Stop. Not used to it. Stop it. I think there's an area where I think we managed it quite well, which was the negotiation side. So with Serbia and Kosovo, you know, 14-hour days, just drip, just trying to get it to work for them. And of course, Iran, that you learn that I always say this to people, you're going to go into a negotiation internationally, assume it will take years. I spent more time with the Iranians than I did with my family. You just keep going. And
who's easier? Just kidding.
The other side of it is that politics is sort of short term. You know, people get elected, they've got 4 or 5 years. You do the horrible stuff early, then you do the nice stuff so people re-elect you, and off you go. And it's very difficult to think 30 years on. And Haiti, my favorite thing that I used to talk about all the time is a mango chutney factory. Because Haiti's been receiving aid since 1955. And if you go there, it is poverty stricken and now has this terrible problem of gangs that are just literally ripping the country to pieces. But when I went for the earthquake, I couldn't find any signs of affluence. And I talked to some amazing people, not least the guy who'd come, Moulay, who'd come to take over the UN position there, who talked about the long history of this. One of the things that Haiti produces is fantastic mangoes, but they don't travel but well. So why don't we have a mango chutney factory? Think about all the jobs and all the processes you create in the process of that you would be able to offer training, you'd be able to do glass blowing, you'd be able to do labels, all of it. And trying to get people, and it may be a stupid idea. My point was to say, if we're going to help them, we've got to do a lot more than just put aid in. 65% of members of parliament, when they were first elected in Haiti in 2010, had never had a salary before. 65%. It's a country that had every kind of problem. There was one cruise ship that came in from America once a week, and it docked at 4 p.m. in a particular part of the island. And the shops and restaurants closed at 3:30. So you had all these rich Americans with money who'd got off and looked around and spent nothing. Now, is that about changing the time the ship comes in, or is that about opening the shops? The point is there was nobody and no way of kind of trying to do that. So what I was trying to get at was you've got to think, if this problem took 50 years to start, why do we think we can solve it in 5? Why do we think one generation of girls going to school is enough? It's not. It never is. Because all the people who don't want them to go are still there. It's got to be embedded deep. And that means you've got to stay and you've got to keep going. And the only place I can think of where we stayed long enough that there's a chance in the future it might work was Somalia. We were there, the EU was over 23 years, and the president who I knew is back in office again. When I went to Mogadishu, they controlled 2 miles around the airfield, and that was it. And all the meetings were in the airport as a consequence of that. And you couldn't get a plane in. I was on a cargo plane from somewhere. And you've seen that this was a country that was capable of trying to at least begin the process of turning around from a failed state. And maybe in 20 years, we'll see another difference, but that will be 40 years worth. That's what I think it takes.
Thank you. Question here.
Sorry to take you back to Ukraine, but just a question that might be on a lot of people's minds at the moment. You talked earlier about feelings and instinct, and I ask you an impossible question, which is, what's your feeling, your instinct about a spring offensive with your knowledge of the protagonists involved in your experience, and not just when, but what then?
I think that President Zelensky is prepared for the fact that there is no indication that Russia has given up. They're doing badly. They've discovered that they don't have the forces that they thought they had in terms of quality, ability, strategy, or anything else. But this is not over yet. And even if it stops being a hot war, it can turn into a frozen conflict where we end up not so different to where it was a year ago, with Crimea and parts of Ukraine, the Donbass, still under the control of Russia, and the country not able to move forward and having to rebuild itself rather than get the reparation it deserves. So I think that we will see more of the war and more conflict. I don't know if he's going to do a spring offensive because I didn't know he was going to do one last year. But it would not surprise me. And everything that I see, everybody I talk to, I don't think we're close to the end yet. But again, back to my point about negotiations, when conflicts end or when things change, they can change quite dramatically very suddenly. And so you always have to have a way of being ready for that moment and always find a way to kind of open a channel as quickly as possible to whoever it is that you think is going to be able to move this forward.
So some Ukrainians are worried that Europeans will, feeling the bite of the energy increases, etc., will start to fall apart as a coalition, that Ukrainians will be forced to a negotiating table and have to negotiate an end. But you're saying actually there needs to be a conversation ongoing even without it being that. So who is it that should be in that conversation, and where should they, is it Lavrov and
No, I'm not.
who is it that should be having a conversation, do you think, to prepare the way for a meeting that will be necessary? And do you think there should be negotiations, and who should decide that?
It's for Ukraine to decide. And I'm not suggesting that they should be talking to Russia now. I'm not suggesting anybody necessarily should be talking to Russia now. What I'm saying is that you have to think about, in 20 years' time, there is Ukraine, safe, secure, living next door to Russia, because that's where it lives. What's happened? How have we got there? And the role that Europe plays, the US plays, NATO plays, the UN plays, the Secretary General plays, somewhere in all this mix, there has to be a kind of plan that eventually gets worked out. And it will be messy and it won't work properly at times and so on. We've seen that a lot. But in the context of Ukraine continuing to prevent Russia from taking its country and to push it back, somewhere in that thinking, people need to be considering, and I mean this in Ukraine as much as anywhere, okay, if in 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years, we are at the point where this is done, how are we going to make sure it doesn't happen again? How are we going to make sure that this country is secure? How are we going to make sure this country is whole? How are we going to make sure that we've rebuilt it properly? How are we going to make sure the people who've gone come home? All of those things. And you always have to have somewhere people who are thinking about that, because it could be in 6 months, or it could be in 6 years, or it could be longer. If you don't, then you end up at the end of the conflict without that thinking having been done. And it's really important for Ukraine that it is Ukraine-driven and Ukraine-led, with the help of the international community, not that it's somebody else doing a deal. Because I think the Kremlin would like nothing else better than to sit down with the Americans and decide what happens to Europe. They certainly don't want to sit down with the EU. They would much prefer to be seen as a superpower making decisions. And the Americans are going to have a really, really important role to play. But if they were here, they'd be saying, yes, but it's got to be the Ukraine to decide what happens. So all I'm saying is, even in the midst of this, somewhere people have to be thinking, okay, where would we go and how would we discuss, and what are security guarantees? What do we mean? What are we looking for? What are the things that are going to make a difference? And who needs to be involved in that?
So there's a flavor in what you say of Putin seeing the United States as the power and the European Union as the lapdog. How does that feel when you're representing the European Union and you're negotiating with the United States? What is that relationship? Does it, at times in your book, it feels as though you're surprised at the absolute kind of dominance of the United States in that relationship?
I say that the obvious partner for Europe is the US. And in my time, it was under President Obama, Secretary Hillary Clinton, Secretary John Kerry. So I had people with whom I could relate very easily. And they are our natural partners. They believed that Europe could do more than it did. They believed that we should be a stronger player, particularly in our own continent. And I think there was a sense of we should be a little bit less reliant on the US, not just on defense, but in a more general sense. And that began with President Obama's pivot, which caused much consternation, but which I saw as being a way of saying, well, you're all grown up now, Europe, come on, you can do this. And I say I think in the book that sometimes they would stride off into the kind of in the future, and you'd be following them, because actually the direction they were going in was where you wanted to go. So they were an important partner for me, but they are a very strong nation, superpower, and they have a greater sense of where they want to be. And it may be not always so easy for them to understand that the European Union, particularly, is a bunch of countries who have to be brought to the same decision. So they would say, we think you should do this. And then I would have to go and persuade or discuss with 28 countries what it is they wanted to do. And it took longer, and it occasionally drove them crazy.
Got a smattering of questions here, and the first one is here.
Law student from South Africa. I have a two-part question. Number one, you mentioned almost getting burned by the fact that the president, after 6 years of negotiations, even being initial, pulls out at the very last second. If perhaps in a hypothetical situation, tomorrow you found out the war has ended and things go almost exactly how they were before the war started, how do you think the EU would react to the fact that now there seems to be evidence that Ukraine is at risk at any time that Russia might try again if they feel they're in a weaker stance? Do you think that the EU has any motivation perhaps to now try and reopen negotiations with Ukraine? And
I'm going to take that one question and then.
Well, the negotiations are already open with Ukraine. If President Putin's achieved anything, he's made Europe more united in wanting to have the relationship with Ukraine he doesn't want them to have. So they are a candidate for membership of the European Union, which will be a long and difficult process in terms of what they call the acquis, the legal basis to do it. But they will become much closer to Europe. So I think that's already a part of the thinking. The broader question you ask, which is a really important one, is how do we make sure it doesn't happen again? And this goes back to my point about negotiation. Negotiation, people think of as being soft and gentle, and it's not. It's quite brutal at times. And it is about making sure that you have in place the means by which you can stop something happening or you can make something happen. And on this, it will be really important that you've got the right level of coalition, interest, and determination to make sure it can't happen again.
Yeah, hi,
Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Mohammed. I'm a master's student from Djibouti. I want to go back to Somalia for a second.
I've been to Djibouti.
Basically, my question is, to what extent do you think that some of these foreign presence in Somalia, whether it be AMISOM and the AU or Operation Atalanta, the EU, to what extent do you think, I know you said it's a success, you've been staying a long time, but at what point is it a hindrance to Somalia becoming independent security-wise? And the federal government actually is kind of dependent on all these other outside forces. And is it maybe time to look at an out or like an exit strategy for all these security forces in the country?
It's really important, actually, that when you put together a military or a civil mission, when I started as foreign policy chief or whatever, I've got this huge title I had, so I never talk about that. I was surprised that there were no exit strategies for the missions. They kind of started and they carried on. And over time, people lose interest. It's not the priority for some it was before. So there are two things I would say. One is you need to put a time limit on the mission, even if only to renew it. But you need to think about that. And the second is your objective should always be to make the country, the place, whatever, capable of doing it themselves. So in terms of the anti-piracy work we did, a lot of it was training missions to support coast guards and the actual ability of the countries to protect themselves, especially off the Kenyan coast, places like Seychelles, where even just patrolling the islands was a hugely expensive and challenging thing for them to do in a small country. But helping them to do that is really important. So yeah, you're right. You need to make people self-reliant and you need to build that into the program that you have.
Question here.
Yeah.
Phyllis Starkey. I was a Labour MP from 1997 to 2010.
I'm looking at you thinking.
I could see that. And I now live less than 5 minutes walk away. I'm retired, obviously. Cathy, I was interested in the reply you gave to the gentleman over there about from Colombia about who should decide in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict when negotiations would start. But that's a state-state conflict. Can you apply the same principles to a state versus occupied territory conflict, which is Israel-Palestine? Who is it there that you would expect to decide when the negotiations should start?
Oh, Phyllis, how long have you got? I mean,
With a really difficult one.
it's interesting because I didn't cover this in the book, partly because I was trying to use examples of particular things that I learned. But actually, I did more trips to Jerusalem and Ramallah than anywhere else. And in the end, the only way that conflict is going to be resolved is, I think, is a recognition that the security of Israel is greater if it's able to live side by side with the Palestinians and live in peace and security. I actually think that the Arab Peace Initiative and the work that's going on potentially through this new thing called the Abraham Accords, which is very fledgling and very sort of nebulous, but it's interesting, allows for nations that can support and help the process in the region to perhaps get more engaged in tackling the issues. And actually, by having a good relationship with Israel, give Israel greater confidence that things could be done. Because the difficulty when it's all about what the US will do, which is what it's traditionally been, and nobody put more effort in than John Kerry to try and resolve it, working beside him on that some of the time, is that, first of all, politics changes and different people come in, as we've seen. And you also get into a situation where it's all about the kind of external security rather than the internal security of the region. So I can't really give you an answer that's going to be satisfactory, except to say that I think I would look more and more to the region to make the decision that in order for it to grow and move on and for Israel to be more secure, it needs to be a regional solution that will, of course, give what we want them to give to the Palestinians.
Next question. Yes.
Sally Atkinson, Global Learning Director for an international food company. I happen to live close by. You were talking about lack of ego and testosterone, and there's been quite a lot of positivity given towards the UK's role in Ukraine and Melinda Simmons' work. And I assume there might be some parallels between the work you were doing and the work she's been doing. Is there something we can learn about the qualities required in these kind of diplomacy situations?
Most diplomats are in the second row of the photograph because the politicians have to be in the front row. They take the political responsibility, and I was and am a politician who was also a diplomat, if you like, in that context. So I've seen it from sort of both sides of it. But the biggest quality that diplomats have is they know how to listen. Really good diplomats know how to listen, understand, work out what's really being said, and find the little chink of light or the bit of the door they can open and kind of get through, and are prepared to stick at it for as long as it takes. So the qualities for me of the brilliant diplomats I've seen at work, and the book is a kind of homage to diplomats, really, it's not about me. It's that they're just very good at wanting to understand what the views of the other side are, if you like. Not to cross a line and become that, but to understand it. Because if you don't know why they think or what they're thinking, you can't find a way through. And they're prepared to sit down with people that you would not want to spend time with. And you're prepared to listen to them.
Yes, exactly. Do introduce yourself.
Right, Richard Seabohm, a former Quaker, formerly the Quaker office in Brussels. Has the European External Action Service lived up to the expectations for it?
We won't know for another 25 years. And I say that because this was the first quasi-institution created in Brussels for the last 50 years. And it was created based on one line in a treaty. The High Representative Vice President shall be helped, aided by an external action service, full stop. And that meant we had to create an organization where we brought people from 12 different buildings, 3 different organizations, plus all the member states, and turned them into a diplomatic service that was European. And I would constantly say, what is it about what we're doing that is European? How do you know you're in Europe? If you go to an embassy anywhere in the world, French embassy, the German embassy, the British embassy, you kind of go in and you kind of know what country you're in. But how will you know you're in Europe when you walk into a delegation? That's going to be the biggest challenge, I think. For me, the most extraordinary thing about it is that when you are able to pick the best from 28 countries and get them to work on a particular problem, it is a much more rich and interesting mix than just any one country. And that's no disrespect to the amazing British diplomats we have or the amazing diplomats from each country. But when you get the chance to pull them together, then you find their experience and knowledge fits together in a different way. So it is quite something.
You last came to speak in the school in a full formal format in 2016. I think it was 2016 and it was when Britain was a member of the European Union back in those times. And in your remarks, you said how difficult it is. I think Callum asked you what the biggest challenge for politicians was, and you said, well, the problem is there are so many problems we can't solve on our own, but when we go to international negotiations, it's always with our domestic political exigencies. And we've seen this play out in the Brexit decision and the politics within the Conservative Party. And I'm just interested in what to you is the way forward now for the United Kingdom?
I still believe there's no issue we can solve alone. We can't do climate change, we can't do pandemics, we can't do creating a strong economy, we can't solve terrorism, we can't deal with anything alone. Nobody can, not unique to us. And so you are always having to build coalitions and alliances together. And you do that in 2 ways. One is my tanker, and the other is a yacht. And the yacht is the G7 or the coalition of the willing who come together around a particular issue. The G7 is a bit of a hybrid, but generally you get people together to solve one crisis and you don't have to believe in much of what else they think. And the yachts are great because they move around at speed, but they don't stay in the water that long. And if the wind drops, that's it. Whereas a tanker keeps going. And so we have left a tanker called the EU, and we've got very interested in yachts.
Quite literally at one point.
We love the E3, we like talking to little groups of countries and so on. But actually, in terms of the difference, it's about the values and the ideals you hold. It's about them, it's about belonging. And we have this whacking great continent called Europe. We are connected to it under the sea. And on it are countries who believe in what we believe in. They're democratic, they believe in human rights, they believe in freedom of the press. I know there are countries that are a bit wobbly, but the journey they're on is the same journey. Because democracy, getting to where you want to get to is never a straight line, it's like that. It goes all over the place. And they are countries who we should naturally have relationships with, whether it's on foreign policy or security or defense. They were astonished that Theresa May took the decision not to have a strong foreign policy connection or a defence connection or a security connection. They didn't expect that would be a consequence of Brexit. And I think we'll have to get closer again. We'll certainly have to get closer economically if we're going to have the kind of economy we want. That's not about rejoining. That's about saying over the next few years, we need to get closer because we can't solve anything alone. And we have a natural affinity that we've kind of ripped apart for now, but we need to get back together a little bit.
And look, you've been on the stump as a politician trying to win elections.
No, I've never stood for election.
Never? Oh my goodness, quite wrong. If you were standing back in Up Holland today, what would your stump version of what you just said be? When you knock on the door and say, I'd like you to vote for me, and they say, well, what about Europe?
That the things that make them feel safe and secure are that they can get a GP appointment, they can get into the hospital, they can get on a bus, they can find fresh food, they can afford the supermarket, they can pay their bills. All of these things are done because we have relationships somewhere. You can't fund an NHS if you don't have the income coming in. So if your economy is smaller, you don't have the money. If the City of London shrinks, you don't have the money. You have to think about how do we get, what's the kind of progression from this stuff over here to what happens to people's lives. And one of the tragedies of politics sometimes is that we don't start where people actually live. We don't say what matters, because traveling around the world, being in some of the strangest, weirdest, dangerous places on earth, everybody wants the same stuff. They want their kids to go to school. They want somewhere to live. They want to feel safe. They want a job. They want to be looked after if they're sick. It's all the same stuff. We're human beings. We always want the same. So why do we not spend the time explaining to people, of course you want that, and that's right and proper. But we can't afford a bus service unless we've got a better economy. That means we need trade. So we need trade agreements. Who are we going to trade with? Who are the people that we can have the strength of an economy with? You can't go on holiday to Spain or France or wherever if we can't work out the controls that allow you to take a dog with you, or you've got to spend 3 hours queuing up with your passport, or because somehow we've not got the relationship with France. That means if something happens to you, we can look after you. It's all that stuff. And it all gets put in this highfalutin thing up here of words that I don't understand in Latin or Greek or wherever. It's put by people who want to give us a kind of, big picture stuff without starting from what really makes a difference. So I would start with a Poland or Wigan, which is the nearest town, by saying, yeah, you want fresh fruit on the stalls that you buy in the market. Where do you think it comes from? How do we get it here quickly enough? Called Europe.
Yes.
Sorry, say again, you're from
Serbia.
Serbia. Ah.
My question would be, of course, because if you go back to 2013, you co-signed on behalf of EU the Brussels Agreement. What's your opinion about the situation nowadays in the Balkans? How do you see the situation unfolding in the next year or so? Having in mind the geopolitical situation in Europe. And my second question would be, how do you see, and what would be your recommendation for the UK government in terms of presence in Western Balkans and the role that UK could play in the region?
You did say as we walked in, bit of a pickle in the Balkans.
Bit of a pickle. Bit of a pickle. Well, so I have absolute faith that Serbia and Kosovo need to be in the European Union, and they are perfectly capable of making agreements between themselves. My experience of politicians in Serbia and Kosovo, because I did the double act, was that they're incredibly brave and they're incredibly determined. And I would say that of your president, Alexander Vučić, and I would say it of many of your politicians, and I would say the same to Kosovo. I think it's really, really important that we don't lose sight of the importance of the region in terms of getting into the EU, but also of being a region that is still grappling with history and legacy and is vulnerable. A lot of countries are poor. Serbia's relatively well off. It's been a country for a long time. It recognizes, I think, at times that it has a strong role it could play in the region, and it's been looking at issues like trade, for example, I know that. But because it's a country that is strong, it has a responsibility as well to do as much as it can to try and resolve the problems and issues with Kosovo. So I will be traveling to the region in the not too distant future to tell them that myself.
I remember two British rock stars trying to persuade American politicians in the 1990s of the need to do debt relief. And one of them, who we can all imagine, swore colorfully to try to shame the United States into taking a better position. And the other, of Irish extraction, Bono, said, if you want to persuade people, speak to their greatness. So it's kind of, we saw a little masterclass. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm a graduate student here at the university. And I wanted to say the tankers need brushes from time to time to get going and keep going.
The tankers need
brushes.
Brushes.
So what would you say would the brushes be the European diplomacy needs? There's a lot of talk in European circles about passing to qualified majority voting in CFSP, about avenues for European military. Are those legitimate, or is that dreaming? What would be the brushes you recommend?
What's the rust you'd knock off the European foreign policy tanker?
It's still, in a way, working out how it's going to function in the future. I'm not a fan of moving to qualified majority voting on foreign policy, and there's for one reason only, and I may be wrong because I've been wrong before, which is that I would be nervous about creating a situation where you had the same group of countries every time who wouldn't join in and who could go around saying, we didn't vote for that. And I can predict, I won't say here, but I can predict who they would be on every issue. And it would be a real problem if you had 2, 3, 4, 5 who didn't vote for a proposition on foreign policy and didn't feel bound by European Union position. Because particularly in the job I held and the job that Joseph Borrell now holds, you need the strength of everybody. So even if it takes you longer and it's more challenging, it's really important, in my view, to get everybody together. Now, you can argue there are some circumstances where what I've just said may not be necessary. But on major issues, I'd really want everybody, because I don't want a country going off to the press and saying, well, we're not part of this, we didn't vote for it. It puts them in a different place. And in terms of how what you would then do on defense issues, there are lots of different views. It's not a kind of either or. Most countries of the EU are now connected to NATO. Where Europe has been able to support defense, it's been on research and development, it's been on training, it's been on coordination in terms of purchasing supplies and so on. And I sort of think it's going to stay around those issues for the time being.
Just a question online, and sorry for taking so long to get to you, Vahid, who says JCPOA, so the agreement, the Iranian agreement that Kathy was talking about, is often presented as an achievement of European diplomacy, and the United States is presented as the party responsible for undermining it. But it's ever more evident that it was the Iranian regime who undermined the agreement by failing to provide clarification on undeclared nuclear sites and its relentless support of extremist groups.
So when the agreement was in force, Iran was the most monitored country on earth. There were monitors in real time in universities, imagine that, where the International Atomic Energy Agency sitting in Vienna was watching all the time what was going on. I am 100% confident that when the JCPOA was in action, Iran was not building a nuclear weapon. It did not have the facility or capacity to do that. When the US pulled out of the agreement, Iran could not deliver on the thing that it said it would deliver on, which was the economy, because businesses would not invest and it was not able to move forward. And we then had the elections and ended up with a much more hardline regime. That does not mean that I was ever happy with the human rights situation in Iran. I got into a lot of trouble when I was in Tehran for meeting with a group of women on International Women's Day, which, trust me, got me into a lot of trouble. And we were not happy with what was going on with Iran in the region. But we were asked to do a very particular job, which was to sort out this big boulder in the doorway that stopped us having any kind of dialogue on anything, just to make sure they didn't build a nuclear weapon. And we did it. The Iranian team we worked with would say to us sometimes that back in Tehran, people would say to them, the Americans will fool you. They will get you to dismantle the sites and then they will withdraw from the deal.
Thank you, Kathy. Our time is at an end for this part of the evening, but for everyone in the room, we have some refreshments outside waiting for you, so you can both ask each other questions and ask our speaker further questions. Perhaps armed with her book, which you can buy outside for £20, and you might even get it signed. But before we do that, I would just like you to join me in thanking Cathy Ashton for a masterclass in what the book is an argument for. It's a really fun book to read with the stories of her engagement with a recent history that most of us have only read in newspapers. But those courses, those lessons about listening, staying the course, having an exit strategy, always thinking about when you're going to need to talk, where you're going to need to talk, with whom you're going to need to talk. Really powerful. Cathy Ashton, thank you so much, and congratulations on your book. Great.